Over objections of state lawmakers, business owners, and advocates of passenger rail service, the Oklahoma Department of Transportation is going forward with plans to sell 97 miles of state-owned rail line to the highest bidder. What makes this sale controversial is the rail line known as the Sooner Sub is the only rail link between the state's two largest metropolitan areas.
Oklahoma began buying up rail lines at salvage value years ago, eventually acquiring more than 800 miles of rail. Since then, much of that has been sold off to a number of small, short-line railroads. Just over 350 miles is left. As the state sold those rail lines, little controversy arose until now. The Department of Transportation is preparing the paperwork necessary to put up for sale the Sooner Sub, a line that runs from Del City to Sapulpa, effectively tying the state's two largest metro areas together by rail. When the state leased the Sooner Sub to Watco, the parent company of the Stillwater Central Railroad 15 years ago, there was no traffic on the line. The BNSF was preparing to abandon it. Since then, the Stillwater Central has brought the Sooner Sub back to life.
You know, you've got a company that's come out here and went from 0 cars to running, the number I hear is 29,000 loaded cars last year. And, you know, that many cars going down that track, you know, that's money in local economies.
John Kalka owns Rock and Rail in Wellston, a company that moves rock for road projects and serves as a drop-off point for the raw supplies building pipelines across the state. Kalka opened the company just 5 years ago as a spin-off of his dozer business in nearby Kearney. The expansion was made possible by the Short Line Railroad that now runs the Sooner Sub.
We use rock in building roads, and we've hauled rock forever, but we have a controlled source now. We're not dependent on somebody else. I mean, we can roll it in here and haul it whenever we want to haul it. People want to move fast. They want you to have rail, so it's put us on the map as far as unloading pipe. You know, we've unloaded right at 1,000 cars of pipe this year.
The Stillwater Central leased other rail lines as well and has now created a network that cuts through the heart of Oklahoma.
We actually started at Owasso, come all the way to Owasso, all the way down to Lawton, and then on over to Snyder. The economic impact of a railroad is usually 20 miles either side of that railroad. If you take that swath all the way down, Stillwater Central touches almost 80% of the population of the state of Oklahoma.
Pat Foster is the general manager of the Stillwater Central. Recently, he spoke to a group of lawmakers and passenger rail advocates who took a ride along the Sooner Sub on board a train provided by the Iowa Pacific Holding Company. 2 years ago, that company made an offer to the Department of Transportation to put the passenger trains on the Sooner Sub, a proposal that was turned down. Ed Ellis is president of Iowa Pacific Holdings. He says that proposal would still work today if the state doesn't sell the line.
Because we think it would be easier to develop passenger on the line with the state owning it and with a short line railroad, Watco, operating it than it would be, for example, with either Union Pacific or BNSF owning it, because they have radically different requirements for passenger trains on their railroads than short lines do.
During that recent train ride, Ed McKegney, Chief Commercial Officer of Watco, addressed what he believes is the real issue driving the interest now behind selling the Sooner Sub. The ever larger oil trains coming out of North Dakota that the BNSF currently has to pass off to the Stillwater Central in Sapulpa, which later offloads them at key points along the Sooner Sub.
You know that oil comes and oil goes. It's always going to be here, but it comes and goes. The base business that keeps the railroad open is the stuff that we ought to be concerned about, and that's the stuff at risk.
And that other stuff McKegney talks about is where John Kalka and scores of other businesses from Owasso to Altus come into play.
If a Class 1 takes it over, I'm going to have to deal with them. I hope I'm big enough to deal with them, you know, but they could very much put me out of business tomorrow.
Kalka sees jobs being created all along the rail line operated now by the Stillwater Central, jobs created by small businesses like his.
It's the jobs that it's generated. Not only, for me, I mean, I've got a guy full-time now that we didn't have for a long time. But you know, it makes us more efficient in the construction business because, you know, we're hauling 20 or 30 miles to do a job instead of hauling 100 miles to do a job.
But there is an even bigger issue where the Sooner Sub is concerned. The lease between the Stillwater Central and the state specifically calls for the development of passenger rail service. Ed Ellis's Iowa Pacific is anxious to get that started now, hoping to show the value of passenger rail service, even if it isn't high-speed rail.
High-speed rail, as it's being contemplated in this country, and maybe even specifically in this corridor, is a red herring, because I have a lot of experience in England and Europe. Virtually every high-speed rail system in Europe, which is what we always talk about, was layered onto something like the Tulsa-Oklahoma City corridor.
Senate President Pro Tem Brian Bingman, a Sapulpa resident, is lukewarm to the idea of selling off the only possible passenger rail link between Tulsa and Oklahoma City.
So I think it's certainly more valuable to the state. So before we would consider selling it, I think we need to look at the economic benefits that it's providing for the area that it serves.
And several members of the House of Representatives are more strident in their opposition. Chickasha State Representative David Perryman made his feelings clear during a recent meeting at the Department of Transportation with several of the railroads that want to buy the Sooner Sub.
If I were you in your positions, I'd be here wanting to buy this line too. But the state of Oklahoma doesn't need to sell it. And I would urge the Department of Transportation to say it ain't for sale.
Under a new state law, however, ODOT no longer gets to make these decisions on their own, as explained by Jeff Van Schaik, Assistant Vice President of Government Affairs for the Stillwater Central.
They're going to have the input of Secretaries of Finance, Agriculture, Commerce, Transportation, and Energy, as well as a study that's going to be done by the Department of Commerce.
While ODOT's request for proposals on the sale of the Sooner Sub closes the end of January 2014, because of the new state law, it is not clear how much longer it will take for a final decision to be made on whether the sale will go through. For its part, the Department of Transportation says the addition of passenger rail service between Oklahoma City and Tulsa does not influence its decision to sell the Sooner Sub.